Welcome to English 4E. This is Class 2A, Term 2A, Class 14, and we are working on the culminating activity for Unit 1, and this is part 2 of that because it's kind of a big activity. My name is Jillian Percy. If you're trying to reach me, email is the best way, jillian.percy@nnecschools.org. You can also reach out to me on Facebook, capital G, capital P, ERCY space capital W AHSA. If you're looking for previous classes that we've recorded this term, you can check out on YouTube. Also, capital G, capital PERCY space capital WAHSA. There are no previous recordings from this year. This is the first time we've run this course this year. When you're handing in work, put it on studentwork@nnec.on.ca. It could also be faxed if you want, 1-800-463-7852. Also, make sure that your name and the course name is on. I teach about 4 or 5 different courses, so I need to know for sure which one I'm looking at. Also, the assignment number, if there is one, and the assignment name, if there is one. It's asking for a rough and a good draft. Please include both of them at the same time and label them. I usually am comparing them to make sure that there is revisions made between the rough and the good draft, which is difficult to do if you don't hand them in at the both time. And also, they're often marked differently. The rough might be worth 10 marks, the good draft might be worth 20 marks. If I don't know which one is which, I can't really go forward with marking until I find out. All right, today's work, we are going to understand the conventions for using quotations, and then we're also going to understand how to use dialogue in our story to convey character and meaning, how to turn our brainstorming into a rough draft, and understand the difference between narrative and dialogue, and then how to alternate between narrative and dialogue, and then understand how to write interesting endings. So this is kind of a big assignment. I don't know if you've really written a short story before. Um, Here are some quotes by some famous authors on their feelings towards short stories. Laurie Moore says, a short story is a love affair. A novel is a marriage. A short story is a photograph. A novel is a film. And then Edgar Allan Poe says, a short story must have a single mood, and every sentence must build towards it. If you're wanting to read short stories, Edgar Allan Poe is like the master of amazing and thrilling short stories. Clark Zot, sorry, I'm not sure how to say it, Zlotchu. Fiction has been maligned for centuries as being false or untrue. Yet good fiction provides more truth about the world, about life, and even about the reader than can be found in nonfiction. I thought that was an interesting quote because a lot of times um, I find some people have prejudices against fiction, like, oh, it's just made up stuff. And it's like, yes, it is made up, but it's made up stuff that is usually trying to convey something about human nature or society or the human condition. Okay. So when you're writing a short story, it's not just, I'm going to put whatever crazy things I want in there. You're also trying to convey something about what you think about life or people. I'm sorry, it has signed me out. I just went through this process like 5 minutes ago, so I thought I had gotten through it. Oh, sometimes Google is very difficult. Okay, TikTok. And here we go again. Okay, so yesterday we worked on brainstorming. That's kind of just getting the ideas down of what you want to say. Sometimes people skip that step, but if you're writing something longer like we are now, it really isn't a step that you can skip because you need to have those ideas down for a more detailed story. But then as you're beginning to write, one of the things you need to think about is what point of view are you going to write from? Every single story is written from a certain point of view from the perspective of the characters. The first person point of view is going to use the pronoun I, me, my. It's written as if the narrator is the person talking to the reader in the story, even if they're nothing like the person in the story, right? It could be an old 60-year-old guy who's never been married, and he's writing from the point of view of a 14-year-old kid, right? It doesn't matter. They're sort of pretending to be that character in a sense, almost like an actor. The writer is limited, however, in this type of narration to only writing what that character can see, hear, feel, and think. So here is an example. I knew I needed to move fast. I had just knocked down the leader of the worst boys at school. He was going to be coming after me quickly before he lost all respect from the others. I ducked down an alley, turned left, and then ducked down another alley. I could hear their voices and risked a quick glance behind me. I couldn't see them yet. If I could just find a place to hide, maybe they wouldn't see me either. Second person point of view is when the writer addresses the reader directly, using pronouns like you, your, and yourself. It sounds a little odd in fiction writing, so it's not used very commonly that way. It is used a lot in advertising, like, do you want to be the boss of your own company? Try this product. At Birch Insurance, we have you covered. Or your family will love Mama's homestyle pancake mix. Like I said, it comes off strange, like someone standing there talking to you. It's pretty hard to tell a story in that format. I don't know if they still exist, but when I was a kid, there used to be choose your own adventure books where they would write a little section and then you got to make a choice. And those were really written in this second person point of view, like you are walking down a forest, you hear a noise. Do you go towards it or do you turn away from it? And you would make a choice and it would tell you, turn to page 15 if you decide to run, turn to page 16 if you decide to stay. But because it's an unusual format, it's not one I recommend for this particular story. This one is really, really common. This point of view is called third person limited. Okay. There's also omniscient, which we're going to talk about in a second slide here. Third person means you're writing kind of like you're an observer standing there, like he, she, they. You're still limited to the character's point of view. So if I had a character called Joseph, I would be standing there as if I was like right next to Joseph, describing what Joseph sees, hears, feels, and thinks. But I couldn't pop over and stand next to Susan and tell what Susan thinks, right? Here is an example from The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. Snideness aside, Rin was deeply grateful for Nez's presence. As much as they had hated each other at the academy, Rin found comfort in having someone else from her class here, on the other side of the country, so far away from Sinigard. It was good to have someone who could sympathize in some way with what she was going through. So we're still kind of describing things from just this one character's point of view, but because you're not limited to the I format, it does give you a little bit more freedom when you're writing. And the next format is called omniscient. And it's often thought of kind of like a godlike point of view because you can switch from one character's thoughts to another, or you can even provide information that none of the characters know at all. Like, little did she know it, but it was her last day on Earth, that kind of thing. Um, this is really common in writing like mysteries and stuff, where the writer wants to drop a few clues for the reader without everything coming from the main characters. So here is an example from Dune by Frank, I think it's Herbert, not Hebert. Yeah, and where it switches back and forth from different characters. That Jessica, the Reverend Mother thought, ah, if only she'd borne us a girl as she was ordered to do. Jessica stopped 3 paces from the chair, dropped a small curtsy, a gentle flick of the left hand along the line of her skirt. Paul gave the short bow his dancing master had taught him, the one used when in doubt of another station. The nuances of Paul's greeting were not lost on the Reverend Mother. She said, "He's a cautious one, Jessica." Jessica's hand went to Paul's shoulder, tightened there. For a heartbeat, fear pulsed through her palm. Then she had herself under control. Thus he has been taught, your reverence. What does she fear? Paul wondered. So in this tiny little section, we've gone from the Reverend Mother's thoughts to Jessica's thoughts to Paul's thoughts. It's a really, really useful type of point of view. But for some readers, they find it a bit confusing that you're bouncing from one spot to another. And some readers just don't like it. They feel like it's sort of artificial to have that much knowledge over the characters. The other thing you're going to be thinking about is showing and not telling. That gets said so often, it's kind of a cliche, but what does it really mean? A lot of times in both speech and in writing, we get used to summarizing a series of events in a really brief statement. This usually isn't as interesting as if you were actually there in real time watching everything unfold. For example, let's say you show up at work with a broken arm and your colleague asks you, "What happened?" And you just simply say, "Oh, I slipped on the ice and broke it." And that's fine in everyday conversation. In this example, you've just told her what happened. You didn't show it to her step by step as if you were watching a movie. But in good writing, that's what we want to do. Show every single step so that the reader feels like they were right there watching it. Otherwise, it gets kind of boring, right? So here's an example of how that might get written rather than said. Um, Mary walked out of the office, her briefcase in one hand and the half-empty coffee mug in the other. She hated the high heels she was wearing, but Sean, the deputy CEO, had been by the company today, and everybody dressed up when he was there. The wind was blowing snow along the street vigorously, whipping her hair along as well, right into her eyes. She struggled to push her hair back and missed seeing the chunk of snow on the sidewalk. Her sharp heel hit the edge wrong, and her knees buckled. She heard the most horrible crunching sound as her hand hit the sidewalk. Pain shot up her arm, and she crumpled around it. She didn't even bother trying to get up. She just dialed 911. They're both describing the same event. One took a small sentence, the other one took a paragraph. But one is way more interesting to read, especially if we're really invested in Mary and whatever's going to happen next to her. Okay. You also want to make sure, remember how we planned out the setting? You want to be able to describe setting without boring your readers. You don't want to just stop everything and spend an entire paragraph describing where they are, especially not in a short story. You could do that in a novel because you've got plenty of room, but for a short story, you've got to kind of almost write in shorthand, right? Write very quickly to get things across. Um, you don't want to stop everything. Yeah. You simply include small bits of important information as the action unfolds. A lot of times you might have like written a bunch of things for your brainstorming. You may not use all of it, but it helps that you've thought about it because that will come through in your writing. So, for example, a sense of time can be conveyed through the use of strategic details, like whether it's past, present, or future. So, modern cars, fashion, celebrities, technology, music, or events that have happened recently can help convey the present. So, for example, Jada got into Amy's car, a blue Honda Civic that looked a lot older than it was. Amy had her iPod hooked up and was blasting Beyonce's new song, Texas Hold'em. She looked a lot more cheerful than she'd been earlier in the day, but her hair looked greasy and was thrown up in a messy bun like she hadn't bothered to shower. So I've conveyed that it's the present by a car, naming a specific current model, naming technology like an iPod, talking about a current singer, and a really new song. So all those things quickly convey, hey, we're in the present. I don't need to say we're in the present. I've conveyed it by the use of details. We can also use clothes, transportation, newspapers, or technology to convey how far in the past or in the present, sorry, I was actually meant the future there, the future might take place. So for this one, remember we talked about technology as kind of any sort of tool. In this one, the idea of when it is kind of conveyed by the transportation and by clothes. Maggie felt like she might faint. The heat of the sun beat down on them, as they traveled slowly along the prairie in the wagon. Staying under the canvas cover kept I switched point of view there, from getting sunburned, but the heat was unbearable. Her husband's face was bright red, as if he hadn't even been wearing his straw hat. Her petticoats were sticking to her legs, and her skirts felt hot and heavy. They had been traveling since dawn, and they were getting low on water. She hoped they came across a river soon. So I'm also trying to convey there the idea they are way out in the middle of nowhere. They're not going to go to the store and buy a bottled water. They're not even near a well. They're just hoping for a river, right? So I'm conveying a little bit about time, but also a little bit about their place there. Okay. The other thing that comes up is a lot of times when you're writing a story, you need to show a transition in time. It's not really common to write a story like what they sometimes call bed to bed. Like you woke up and events happen, and you describe every single minute, right? For most of us, not every single minute of our life is super interesting. And that's true in our story. So a lot of times you're gonna have to kind of jump to the next interesting time frame. So some phrases might be things like, a few hours later, Jessie was, it took 2 whole weeks before she heard back from the cute guy in geography. When she woke up the next morning, the week flew by so quickly that it was Saturday before she knew it. You just need to give your reader kind of a heads up that time has moved on and how much time has moved on. So they're kind of clear on what's happening. You don't want a confused reader because confused readers don't enjoy what they're doing. You also want to show transitions in place. That's generally easier, but here's the thing. You don't want to have to like describe the transportation to everything like and then they got in the car and then they went down Main Street and then they turned here or then she got in the plane. A lot of times travel isn't really that interesting, especially if it's not crucial to the story. So a lot of times you want to get that part over with kind of quickly and get back to the exciting part. So things like when she finally arrived at work, he showed up at the bar that night. I barely noticed the trip, but when we crossed over into Canada again, I heaved a huge sigh of relief. Jason was still thinking about the conversation later that day at the gym. The other thing you can do to show a transition is start a new paragraph. That's a great way to kind of give the reader kind of a subtle little signal. Hey, something new is going on. And that new is just we've transitioned to a new place. Okay. Narrative versus dialogue. Narrative is the part of writing where you're describing the characters, the action, the scenery. It is normally the main part of the writing, although some readers find this part kind of boring to read. Dialogue is where the characters actually talk to each other. You need to balance out both of these in your writing. However, because short stories have very limited space, they often use limited amounts of dialogue because it takes up a fair bit of space. So great dialogue can really bring a character to life, but the narrative is often what drives the action actually forward. Okay. Um, Direct quotations versus indirect. Sometimes when we're writing, we're reporting actual speech, whether it's real or imaginary, that part doesn't matter. And all the rules about quotations will apply, which we're going to talk about. Those are direct quotations. But sometimes we're just kind of reporting what someone else said in a general way rather than an exact quote. And when we do that, we don't need to use quotation marks and we don't need to worry about following any of the other rules about quotations. This is called an indirect quotation. And usually it means that someone's reporting what somebody else said in a general way. So an example of an indirect quote might be, Dad got mad and said we needed to play ball outside. That's indirect. If it was direct, I would have written something like, Dad said, go play outside. Another example might be, oh, we don't need to wait for Sarah because she said she wasn't coming. Again, if that were a direct quote, I would write something like, Sarah said, I'm not coming. Okay, so handling dialogue. Dialogue can be a bit tricky just because of the different conventions about how to write things, okay? Um, Usually, not always, usually there's what's called a tag. And the tag tells us who is speaking and how they are speaking. And those tags can come at the beginning before the quote, in the middle of a quote, or at the end of the quote. So just kind of quickly showing you at the beginning, just like any other sentence, you're going to have a capital letter at the beginning of it. And then you're going to tell me who, he, and what they did. Yelled. He yelled. She whispered. The principal shouted. The teenager muttered. And then after this, you would have the quote. But right before the quote, you have a little comma that just kind of sets off the tag from the actual quote. You can also have a tag right in the middle. You could have a quote in front and then a tag and then finish off a quote. Um, I'll show you that more, but here you can see it's the exact same words, but now they're not capitalized because they're in the middle of the sentence. I do still have the comma afterwards. I don't need a comma beforehand. Okay. And then if it's at the end, instead of ending with a comma, I'm going to end with a period. And I still don't need a comma ahead of time. And I still don't need anything to be capitalized. Okay. So let me see. We talked about that. Yep. If a tag comes at the beginning of a sentence, it's capitalized. Yep. Middle, we talked about that. Okay, good. We're good there. Sorry. If the quoted speech ends in a period, but the overall sentence is not done, we just use a comma. However, if the quoted speech, what somebody said, ended in an exclamation point or a question mark, we still use those. However, they all occur inside the quotation marks. So here you see, I want hot dogs, comma, she said. Can we have hot dogs? She said. I hate hot dogs, she said. And each time we got the quotes in front, the quotes in the back, and the punctuation just inside that quote. And there's nothing afterwards. You don't need a comma between the quotation and the tag when the tag comes at the end. When the end of the quotation is also the end of the sentence, the period is going to come inside the quotation marks as long as the original sentence would have used a period too. This is also true for a question mark or an exclamation point. He said, we'll get into the supper line now. And there's a period. I don't need to put, see if I had a second one. It looks kind of weird. Why have I got two periods there? I don't need to. She asked, can we come home now? Again, I don't need another period. I've already got the question mark. He yelled, help. Same thing. I don't need a period after that. When the original sentence ends in a different punctuation mark than the quotation is using, simply put that after the quotation marks. That isn't as common because it's kind of hard on the reader to understand, but it does occur. Put the correct quotation, sorry, the correct punctuation for the quotation itself inside the punctuation marks. Did she really tell you, get out of here? So here, they're quoting somebody who is yelling. So the yelling has got an exclamation point, but the person is asking a question. So there's a question mark after all of that. Here, this person is like excited or upset or something. I can't believe he said, my real name is James Bond. And because they're excited, they've put exclamation point there. Both parts of a divided quotation are enclosed in quotation marks. And the first word of the second part is not capitalized unless it begins a new sentence. That sounds really confusing until you see it. So, for example, this soup is the first part of the quotation. And they've got the tag in the middle. The elder said, and then they've got the second part of the quote. Tastes just like my cucumbers. Now, because the elder's in the middle of a conversation, this second quotation, we don't put a capital. If they had said something like, this soup tastes just like my gookums, and then started a new sentence like, how did you do it? The new sentence would have a capital just because new sentences always have a capital. Okay. Quotes within a quote. This is another tricky area that you're not going to see very often, but it does come up. If you have to have one character directly quoting something another character said, Use double quotes for your main dialogue and single quotes for the quote within a quote. So here's an example. Here's my main quote my character is saying, and then he said, "This is your last chance around here, Jimmy." And see how there's a little single quote talking about maybe the cop said this. This is your last chance around here, Jimmy. So he's telling the story, and then he's continuing to talk. What a jerk, he said. Now you can see that's a bit hard to read, so writers don't use it that often, but it does come up. Okay. When you write dialogue, you have to begin a new paragraph whenever the speaker changes. If a new person talks, you change paragraphs. That way, even if there's no tag, we have an idea who's talking, especially if there's only two people having the conversation. So she says, "Sit down," she said. "Let's talk. Are you going to do this every day?" Now, here it says what? And it doesn't tell us the tag. Presumably, we know who she's talking to. Now, we start a new paragraph because she's answering him. What do you mean, what? If you don't include tags for too long, it can get a little bit confusing, but doing it for a few times can kind of move your dialogue along a bit quicker for the reader. And then we've got, you can use a pair of dashes to indicate that someone isn't finished talking, right? Whether it's a question, a statement, a yell, whatever it is, they may finish it later, or they may not get a chance to finish their question. So here, in the next little bit, somebody gets interrupted. And so they aren't finished their sentence. So the writer doesn't want to put a period because that sounds like the guy was done talking and he's not. So it says here, "First of all," he said, "if you can learn a simple trick, son, you'll get along better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view." Huh? And that's the person interrupting them. And now see how there's another dash? That shows that he's continuing his sentence. "Until you walk 2 moons in his moccasins." So here was an end dash to show that he wasn't finished. Here is a beginning dash to show that he's finishing the thought he had started earlier. Okay. When writing only a part of a quoted sentence, like if you're doing a research essay and you're trying to quote somebody important said, don't begin the quotation with a capital letter unless the person you're quoting capitalized it or it's the first word in your sentence. Sometimes you would also use an ellipse. Remember that dot, dot, dot to show that it's not a complete sentence. Robert Checkwich admitted he had not found many novels that were based in First Nations communities. It's the middle of the sentence, so we don't put a capital there. It just would sound strange. We do put a capital if it's the first word in our sentence, although it sounds really awkward there to me. That were based in First Nations communities, Robert Checkwich admitted he had not found in many novels. Yeah, it just sounds really strange there. So when you're quoting someone, you have to kind of think about how it sounds. All right. Now, all that is just how to punctuate dialogue. It's not really talking about how to write good dialogue. So this little video is talking about bad dialogue versus good dialogue and what makes it good versus bad.
The best way to learn about dialogue is by studying the good stuff as well as the bad. And that's what we're going to be doing today, so stick around. What's up, guys? My name's Brandon McNulty. I'm a writer, I'm the author of Bad Parts, and welcome to my writing channel. One of my subscribers requested a video, and I'm going to be having examples of both. I want to start out by explaining what makes good dialogue good. And I think there are three things that help define good dialogue. The first thing that good dialogue does, it sounds natural. And this is going to vary from character to character. Obviously, what Marty McFly from Back to the Future says in his movies wouldn't work in Lord of the Rings. And what Frodo says in Lord of the Rings wouldn't work in the world of Back to the Future. So you have to be aware of who is speaking and in what world they're speaking. But regardless of who your characters are and where your story world is, the dialogue has to sound natural. The second thing good dialogue does, it attacks or defends. And that's because good dialogue involves conflict. It involves characters trying to learn something that another character doesn't want to tell them. It involves characters trying to push a worldview on another character who is defending against it. Your characters should always be wanting something in their scenes, and they should be trying to obtain information through dialogue exchanges. And the third thing that good dialogue does, it expresses unspoken meaning or subtext. And this means that there's some kind of meaning beneath the surface. And I think the best way to think about this is that when you have the spoken word going back and forth between two characters, you have to remember that there's got to be some emotions hiding beneath it. For instance, if you've ever seen a married couple arguing about something stupid, you know that what they're really arguing about is much bigger than that stupid thing. They're not arguing about whether or not they're going to have chicken for dinner tonight. They're arguing about some kind of conflict that's going on within their marriage. So keep that in mind. There should be some higher stakes beneath the spoken words in your dialogue. Now we're going to talk about bad dialogue. And for this video, I came up with 5 specific types of bad dialogue. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go through each type. I'm going to explain what it is. Then I'm going to give you an example of the bad dialogue. And then I'm also going to give you a good example that you can use in its place. Now, the first type of bad dialogue is on the nose dialogue. This is when you state the obvious. It's when you're just stating thoughts and emotions without any subtlety, without any subtext. There's nothing beneath the surface. You are just saying exactly what you're thinking or exactly what you're feeling. An example of this type of bad dialogue comes from Attack of the Clones. It shouldn't surprise anyone that I'm going to be talking about Attack of the Clones today. But in Attack of the Clones, if you remember the one scene where Anakin and Padme are talking beside the fire, and Anakin just completely spills his unfiltered emotions out to her, it's completely on the nose. I'll play it for you right now.
Now that I'm with you again, I'm in agony. The closer I get to you, the worse it gets. I'm haunted by the kiss that you should never have given me. You are in my very soul, tormenting me. Believe me, I wish that I could just wish away my feelings.
And this is, of course, on the nose dialogue. It's stating exactly what he feels. It is not natural, and it feels totally cliched. It feels like something that's just coming out of an afternoon soap opera. And because of it, we just, we don't buy into it. It doesn't feel real. And it's just dull because there is no deeper meaning here. He's just saying exactly what he feels. There is nothing to read into. Now, if you want a conversation between two lovers that is a lot more fun, take a look at Back to the Future, the early scene between Marty and his girlfriend Jennifer. They're discussing their upcoming romantic trip to the lake. I'll play it for you now.
Does your mom know about tomorrow night?
No, get out of town. My mom thinks I'm going camping with the guys. Well, Jennifer, my mother would freak out if she knew I was going up there with you, and I get the standard lecture about how she never did that kind of stuff when she was a kid. I mean, look, I think the woman was born a nun.
She's just trying to keep you respectable.
Well, she's not doing a very good job.
Terrible.
Okay, so notice how neither of these two characters outright states how they feel about each other. It's obvious that they're boyfriend and girlfriend. They got this thing going on. They're hoping to hook up at the lake. But the feelings here are all in the subtext. The dialogue itself is just a lot of fun, and it just dances around the subject of the romance, the sex, everything else that's going on here. But it's much better than the Star Wars example because neither one of these characters is outright stating, oh, I'm so crazy about you, I love you, anything like that. It's much more fun when they just kind of hide their feelings a little bit, even though we know what's going on here. The second type of bad dialogue is melodrama. And I've talked about melodrama on the channel before. And what it is, it's emotion that is way over the top. It's emotion that is not earned. Sometimes you'll see stories where two characters are just yelling back and forth at one another, but you don't really care about the conversation. You don't feel the anger, you don't feel the passion or anything like that because it isn't earned. That's what melodrama is. Now, for an example of melodrama, I want to take it from one of my favorite video games, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I love this game to death, but it opens up with a prologue that has some absolutely horrendous dialogue. Now, for context here, the only thing you really need to know is that the guy in blue here on your screen, his name is Richter. He's a vampire killer, and he's going after Dracula. And once he meets Dracula, this happens.
Time, monster. You don't belong in this world.
It was not by my hand that I'm once again given flesh. I was called here by humans who wish to pay me tribute.
Tribute? You steal men's souls and make them your slaves.
Perhaps the same could be said of all religions.
Your words are as empty as your soul. Mankind ill needs a savior such as you.
Okay, so I'm going to pause there. We don't have time for the whole video. If you get a chance though to watch it, it's really a really interesting video. They're just kind of talking about the big idea is the dialogue should sound how people actually talk. And in real life, we don't just blurt out these really, really dramatic statements. And the idea when he talks about unearned, we all have times where we are shouting at people. It's not that you could never do that, but people don't usually walk into a room and immediately begin shouting at each other for no reason. They kind of work their way up to it. So when you're doing your dialogue in a short story, think about what kind of emotion level you already have going on in the story. And you'd have to lead up to something if you want really strong emotion. Okay. Going over to describing people. Remember, we were talking about narrative. You don't need to stop everything when a new character enters a room and then just describe them from head to toe. We thought about it, we brainstormed it so that we could picture them, but we don't necessarily need to tell our reader every single thing we thought about, okay? A few brief words of narrative or dialogue can give you a quick impression of the character. The wonderful part of our brains is that if you just give them a little bit of raw material to work with, they'll fill in the gaps happily with all the other ideas that we have in there, right? So, for example, an enormous man who looked like he ate bear cubs for a snack came charging at her, roaring incoherently. I haven't told you anything about how he's dressed or his hair or his eyes or anything, but I bet that everybody out there kind of immediately pictured somebody that was like that, right? We may not have all had the same picture, but for the purposes of the story, that might not matter. There was no fighting a man that size. She turned and sprinted for the safety of the barn. As she ran, she was scanning ahead, hoping for some makeshift weapon she could use against him, a shovel, a rake, anything at all. So I just gave a little tiny bit of description and I used an analogy like he ate bear cubs for a snack. That's kind of over the top and ridiculous, but it gives you an idea of how big he might be. I didn't have to say an enormous man wearing brown trousers and a white shirt came running. Like I don't have to be that formal. I'm not writing a police report. I'm trying to get across some ideas in a novel or a short story, I guess. Okay. A lot of people aren't crazy about writing the rough draft. Moving from writing the brainstorming to writing the rough draft is really hard. And I noticed that for myself, right? It's different than just writing a paragraph. Here's kind of some inspirational quotes from some different novelists on the importance of writing your rough draft. The beautiful part of writing is that you don't have to get it right the first time, unlike, say, a brain surgeon, Robert Cormier. It's better to write a bad first draft than to write no first draft at all. Will Shetterly. The first draft is just you telling yourself the story. Terry Pratchett. I like that idea so much where you're not trying to impress somebody else. You're just kind of trying to tell the kind of story that you find interesting to read. So think about that as you're kind of moving from brainstorming to writing your rough draft. Okay. So after I've kind of thought about all of these things, I need to think about how to get started, right? I'm not gonna, like, I know in our planner we had here's our setting, here are our characters, here's our problems, but I'm not gonna write it that way. I don't want to write here's, a paragraph on setting, here's a paragraph on the characters. It's gonna sound a little bit odd if I do that, kind of stilted, right? So instead, I want to think about how can I start the story in an exciting way that makes the reader want to read this. So some ideas that came to me from my story was when the king gives her the quest to deliver the package. That might be the start, not the setting, but the problem, I guess. When she's picking out companions and gathering supplies, that's a little bit further down the road, but it might be a little more interesting. Or I could start them right in the middle of the first problem and she can flash back to why they're here or maybe make some sort of comment that kind of covers it very quickly. Or I could have some sort of heated dialogue with somebody to help establish her character, what she's like, what the other characters around her are like right away. Description of the scenery, I've put that there. unless you have a really unusual scenery, I wouldn't start there. If you're writing a story that has them like on the planet Mars, then yeah, you're probably going to want to describe the scenery right away, just so the reader understands what's happening. Um, Internal questioning of the importance of this task. That sounds oddly formal. It's a little bit like the heated dialogue. It doesn't grab me, but it is one thing you could do. Again, it would depend a little bit. Like if you had somebody who's I don't know, something very, very dramatic where the internal questioning might be interesting. Yes. Otherwise, no. So when I went to go and try and write my my initial paragraph, I wanted to have here where she's picking out her companions and she's gathering supplies to help her on the quest, right? My character is called Larissa. She's going on this quest where she's got to deliver a package to the king. And then when I went to do that, I realized I I don't know what her companions are. I haven't given them any names. I haven't thought about them at all. I can't even picture them. How am I going to write when I haven't done that? And when we're talking about writing being a bit of a circular process, this is the idea. Like I went to write and all of a sudden realized, oh, I need to do some more planning first, and then I can write. So here's some of my planning, right? I thought about, I don't want too many characters because it's a very short story. So I given her four characters to walk along with. Ike is a grizzled old warrior in his 50s. He's a good fighter, not good with authority, drinks a bit too much, dresses pretty disheveled. Um, I kind of grabbed this picture off the internet. I wouldn't use this in my actual story. It's just for me to help picture it. If you take a look really closely, they've kind of damaged his eye, like he can't see. I'm not worried about that part. I just kind of wanted the sense of how he's older and he's got a certain build and that kind of idea. And then I wanted somebody really young with her. Um, I named this guy Eden. He's maybe 18 or 20. He's eager, he's fit, he's athletic. He hasn't got a lot of experience, but he can handle a sword. Maybe he's some sort of childhood friend or someone she knows from when she grew up. And he's probably a bit gullible, like he'll just kind of believe whatever anybody tells him. And then I've got Farron. Farron is our guide, right? He knows lots of shortcuts. He's traveled widely. He knows many people in different countries they'll be traveling through. I'm not sure if I'm going to make him trustworthy if he's going to be somebody that betrays them. He is very chatty. And then I've got Baylor. Baylor is good with horses and other animals. He's in his 30s. He's friendly, seems reliable. Why isn't he already working for somebody? I'm not sure why. Um, and I'm not sure, is he going to be reliable or not? Is he going to turn on her in the last minute? I'm not positive. Maybe he's going to be her secret helper. I think that's enough people for now because it's a short story. So here is my tentative title, Larissa's Journey. That kind of states the problem right away. I might think of something fancier, but at the moment that works for me. Larissa grumbled under her breath as she tightened the saddle on her horse. They were supposed to hit the road hours ago. She eyed the sun gleaming brightly overhead with its noontime heat and cursed softly. It had taken so much longer to gather up supplies for this journey than she had thought. Hiring fit companions to join her on the journey had been harder than she expected as well. She had envisioned her crew as young, fit, experienced as both fighters and guides. But since she was a relatively unknown expedition leader, none of the unemployed guardsmen who met that criteria trusted her enough to hire on. Nor was the pay she could offer enough to really overcome their reluctance. Instead, she got the misfits. She resisted the urge to look over her head at the crew, her crew, straggling along behind her. Larissa had a suspicion that the look on her face would make her feelings all too clear. No point scaring off her team before they even left town. Truthfully, she didn't even have to look. She could already hear Eden's quick footsteps just behind her, eager to be on his way on his first mission. Behind him came the measured steps of their guide, Farron. He seemed competent and had come highly recommended. He had certainly been expensive enough to hire, but she had to have somebody who knew the land the way he did. And then behind him came Ike, walking in the slow, measured steps of an old warrior who was in no hurry if no one was threatening to kill him. Baylor was up ahead, getting the rest of the horses saddled and packed. Now, I have just briefly mentioned each character and mentioned at least one thing about them. I haven't even remotely used all the ideas I planned out, but I might use them as I'm going along. And even if I didn't, having an idea of who they are helps me when I'm writing. I don't need to tell the reader every single thing I thought of. Okay. I could stop and edit right now. There's all sorts of problems I can see in that, but I won't because if I do that, I might cause writer's block, which is basically just the idea that you get kind of frozen or paralyzed and afraid to write on. I already know a lot of my own writing faults. I tend to write too much or too long. I sometimes add too many details that I have to take out later. And I also can have trouble getting the story started. But here's the thing, none of that even matters, right? If it takes me a while to get to the point and I end up scrapping the first few paragraphs later, oh well, better than staring at the page so worried about making mistakes that I never get started at all. Okay. I wanted to kind of briefly talk about paragraphing, okay? Up until now, we've been writing sort of paragraphs by themselves and very rigidly trying to follow a paragraph structure where there's an opening sentence, some body details, and then a closing sentence. But when you're writing a story, that's not really the kind of paragraphing we're talking about, right? Now, different readers often have, or writers have different ideas on when to start a new paragraph. There are some that you kind of have to follow. You have to start a new paragraph if a new character is talking. You should start a new paragraph if there's been a big change in the time. If you've changed places, that's a good time to start a new paragraph. If a new character is being introduced, especially if they're really important, that might be a good time to start a new paragraph. Or if a new activity or significant obstacle comes up, that can be a good time to start a new paragraph. One thing to keep in mind, reading a lot of text at once can get very tiring to the eyes, which is one reason why writers use paragraphs. Starting a new paragraph can be a way to break up the text into smaller chunks for the reader. For me right now, because I'm writing on these little slides, I kind of decided that I'm going to write about each new obstacle and if as a paragraph. If that seems too long, I'm going to split them into 2 or 3 smaller paragraphs. It's kind of like I'm using the paragraph is like a longer period, right? It gives the reader a little longer mental pause. It signals them that that section's ended and something new is about to begin. Sorry, I'm talking too fast because I'm aware I'm kind of running out of time here. Okay. Um, See, I really do want to cover this. All right, if I don't get to everything, we'll kind of start covering things tomorrow or maybe Monday. This is Jamie Golden. I thought that she's a writer. I thought she did a beautiful job of explaining the importance of obstacles. We need to include obstacles for our characters to overcome. If they succeed immediately at everything they attempt, the story and the characters have a good chance of being boring, not to mention making the story over as soon as it begins. Beyond that, while story obstacles slow down the progress of our story, they also do a lot to help our storytelling. Obstacles add the potential of failure, which creates uncertainty and tension that keeps your readers interested. Will the characters succeed? Failure is inherent in obstacles. In other words, it's an automatic part of any kind of obstacle. They could fail even if they don't fail. Obstacles also create more meat for the middle of our story. Without them, our story would just be a simplistic point A to point B. Like, oh, so and so delivered the package to the king. Well, I mean, we've told the story, but it wasn't very exciting or fun to read. Remember that the main idea of telling a story is you're trying to entertain somebody. You're trying to make it interesting and exciting, right? Picture that you've got a bored kid who you're trying to keep entertained so that they don't like wander off and get into trouble. Maybe the power's out and you're trying to keep them busy and you're telling them this interesting story to kind of keep them entertained while there's not their usual entertainment. Okay. Obstacles also offer the opportunity to trigger consequences. In other words, if they do fail, there's some sort of consequence. Things might happen depending on your story. Maybe somebody gets fired or hurt, or a really dramatic story might have somebody die. It increases the stakes and it can make the situation worse for them, which for the reader can be more interesting to read. Right? Obstacles force our characters to change. They'll need to change externally, maybe by choosing a different approach, but it can also cause them to change internally. They may need to re examine their priorities, their fears, their beliefs, their strengths or the weaknesses while they face and try to overcome these challenges. Obstacles can also force characters to make hard choices or sacrifices. In turn, these choices and sacrifices can reveal truths about what our character is like inside. This also often goes to getting across your message or your scene or your theme, right? The thing that your character is willing to give up in order to get something else shows what that character feels is important and also what you as a writer feels is important. Also, without challenges, our characters won't seem as heroic. To be heroes, our characters need to show courage and determination in the face of failure. Each obstacle gives us a chance to show and not just tell their inner strength as they face potential failure. Without obstacles, characters have no struggle and nothing to overcome. Okay, this seems like a good spot to stop. I haven't quite gotten to the end. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Try to tackle writing a little tiny bit of your story tonight if you can. Even if you just put a timer on and say, okay, I'm going to sit down for 10 minutes or 15 minutes and I'm going to write as much as I can and then I'll give myself a break, right? If you're finding this a hard assignment, just tackle it in tiny little bits, okay? And we'll talk about endings later on. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope this was helpful. Please reach out to me if you're having a hard time and need some assistance. Thank you so much.